Hi, I'm Joe Marakin, co-creator for Executive Points of View. I'm a CISO and Chief Compliance Officer for a media corporation that broadcasts over 1,700 television stations around the world. Over my 20-year career, I've had the privilege to work for companies like Accenture and IBM, where I have consulted for some of the world's largest energy and media companies. I've also had the opportunity to participate in significant M&A deals in the telco, media, and energy space. Prior to my business career, I was a United States naval officer. I'm a combat vet that served in theaters like the Persian Gulf, Kosovo, and the other areas. I'm a Texas Aggie, where I studied international affairs at the postgraduate level. Welcome to Executive Points of View.
A couple of years ago, I had the privilege to speak at Kennesaw State University on the topic of critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, and terrorism. Given the events of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, I thought it would be appropriate to refresh the presentation in video format, and I also asked Professor Brown of Kennesaw State University for an interview. Professor Brown holds a PhD in business administration. He teaches criminology, cybersecurity, and terrorism. Dr. Brown is also a retired Army colonel. He is a decorated combat veteran who has been awarded the Bronze Star and Legion of Merit. Before we dig into the interview, let's take a look at a few of the slides from the presentation. From school, you might have learned that humanity evolved during an ice age, which is characterized by long, intense periods of cold, followed by short 10 to 15,000 years of warmth. We live in one of those interglacial periods. The interesting thing about the slide is that for the last 300,000 years that we've been on this planet, we have barely clung on to life, just barely above subsistence levels most of the time. It's only been in the last couple of hundred years that our population has really grown to 7.5 billion people, giving us the exponential world. This exponential world has allowed our people to specialize and be able to solve virtually any problem that is presented before us. There are several advances that gave us the exponential world, but one of the most material one was our access to new and novel sources of energy, like nuclear power and the fossil fuels. Today, our energy mix is mostly comprised of fossil fuels, but there is a growing component of renewables and nuclear power, and that energy mix is projected to continue into the future. One piece of information that's not as clearly known is the linkage between fertilizers and energy. Or most of us are not taught about the Green Revolution and the role that synthetic fertilizers play and where they come from. The production of fertilizers requires a significant amount of natural gas today, using something called the Haber-Bosch process. What that means is that today, a full 50% of the people on this planet are here because of food that was able to be produced from these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. If we put it another way, we could say that half of the nitrogen atoms in the bodies of anybody listening to this presentation were processed in a petrochemical refinery somewhere during their lives. It goes further than that. If we look at the other half of the population, the majority of those people are here because of the exponential world that energy has created. So if we start removing things like shipping, railroads, tractor trailers, modern farming equipment, irrigation, pesticides, refrigeration, and things of the sort, then our populations dwindle even more. So if the U.S. has 320 million people or 327 million people, we can half it by just removing the population that are fed by nitrogen fertilizers, which require natural gas to produce. And then if we remove all the other components like refrigeration and transportation and storage and preservatives and things of the sort, then our population dwindles even further. And if we remove things like antibiotics and vaccines, then our populations really start to dwindle into pre-industrial levels. So from a risk perspective, if we were to shut down the power or the energy to a major city, then within the matter of a few days, most of the food within our refrigerators, in our stores, and in our homes would rot. And we would have no way to communicate with each other. We would have no way to heat our food. Within the matter of a few days, it would be a national emergency. That's why this topic of critical infrastructures is so important. And the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident can be seen as a harbinger of things to come if we don't address this problem as quickly as possible. Now let's go back to the interview with Professor Brown.
Sure, Joe. Again, thank you for having me on, and thank you for asking. I think a couple of years ago when you came to our class, we were talking about critical infrastructure protection and the threats there and risk assessment we talked about, and all the things you need to do to protect those critical infrastructures from hackers, all sorts of nefarious actors in the world. And so I think what we saw with the Colonial Pipeline is this actually play out, because we talked about in the class, it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's a matter of when and to what degree. So going forward, well, let's just back up. For the 2 years since you were at the class, I can't believe it's been that long. Yeah. The fact that there's been many smaller happenings, events like this, that never made the news.
No, that's true.
And the reason for that is obviously that if I'm a fraudster or I'm hacking and I'm the companies try to stay out of the news, obviously for the right reason, because it's bad publicity. It creates bad goodwill. It's bad for a company. It's often bad for the revenue. So you want to stay out of the news. Well, so within those 2 years, there's been a lot of these that have happened that we didn't hear about.
Smaller events that
never
rose to the level of it making them even local.
Or they were able to keep it quiet. It didn't impact the public. The Colonial Pipeline is significant because it impacted so many people over so many states. So we have to look forward then and say, what are the lessons learned from this? First of all, we know that layered security is the most foolproof. There is no silver bullet per se. But
nothing will guarantee you security. But
layered security is really, in my estimation, is the best way to protect. That includes all the things that weren't done in the Colonial Pipeline, such as patching the software and doing all the updates, endpoint detection.
The patching and the updates, I think, are the key items associated with that particular incident.
Yeah.
The other question I wanted to ask you was one around scale.
Yeah.
This, in our class, or in your class, we talked about how most of the infrastructure, the core infrastructures are fairly well protected, but the weak points tend to be the technology elements that are associated with them, the computers that operate, schedule, do the logistics associated with doing this work, and then also the scale of energy and how it affects everything that we use and everything that we do. So any thoughts on those two concepts of either the scale of it or the weak points associated?
That's an excellent point, Joe. As we know, the Internet of Things, IoT, everything is interconnected, really. All of those systems and components, some older than others, some considered less important. Well, if whatever the importance of the system, if a foreign actor or I say foreign actor, it doesn't have to, it can be foreign or from the United States, because these bad actors are literally across the globe, including the United States. Obviously, the ones that come to mind are China and Russia, the usual suspects, North Korea. But with the interconnectivity of all of these systems, everything on it has a small computer or a mini chip that talks automatically with other components. So the real threat to me, as we've studied very often, is the insider threat.
Right.
Is the trusted individuals within the company that are charged with sometimes even maintaining the security itself. That is the most dangerous, and study after study and empirical evidence shows that these insider threats are the most vulnerable.
You bring up two trains of thought for me. One deals with the international aspect of this and cryptocurrencies and how we are paying, how these ransoms are being paid to external parties. And then you bring up the very interesting side of the internal factor, which is always a concern for a cybersecurity professional who's working in an enterprise, and it somewhat sets cybersecurity aside from everything else, because you have to keep an objective view that your threat actor could actually be inside your perimeter, working within your company.
And Joe, what we want to really stress here, and this is part of the thing in my dissertation that we really focused on, was that these could be people that have been with the company many years and have security clearances, if it's government, or proprietary knowledge,
which is very useful.
It is, and access to systems that other people wouldn't have. And case after case, we've seen where these people and sometimes are the biggest threat.
And that's when I speak at different locations, that's one of the things that I emphasize, that many times we tend to somewhat romanticize the threat as coming from some faraway country.
Yes.
Some faceless people, you don't know
Right.
exactly where they are, where in reality the threat could be the person who's sitting in the office next to you, or working in some data room somewhere.
That's right.
With intimate knowledge of the operations and the technology that you're operating, along with its weaknesses.
And Joe, that's the key to remember is these people are particularly dangerous because they know the vulnerabilities. So we do the risk assessment, we determine vulnerabilities, we try to mitigate those, we have a process and a system to do that. And many times these people that are trusted with the system, they know exactly
Absolutely.
where's the easiest way, the quickest to take it down to where it's out of service until the ransom's paid.
And some of those people are also in positions to be able to put up roadblocks to keep an effective cybersecurity program from being deployed within that particular entity.
They often know the system better than management in many cases.
Yes.
Management has a managerial overview and a working knowledge of it, but they're not the technical experts with the patching and all of those things. So we have to remember that that's the critical infrastructure. The people we trust
Right.
hold the keys to our success, first and foremost.
So we have to make sure that we have the right people. And
It starts with selection.
It's the selection.
And many people you see replete with history, they start out on the right side,
Right.
and either money, greed,
Money
or
corrupts.
something. Money corrupts.
Money corrupts people.
Absolutely. And so what we see is many cases where people start out and they were the stalwarts of the company, very trustworthy, and you get in debt, you want a new car, you want a new house. And so there's a lot of things you can do to protect it.
Those are really good points. I think I read, and this number might not be perfectly accurate, but I think the group DarkSide had been paid, I think, $60 million or something like that.
Yeah.
Colonial Pipeline, I think, paid over $4 million.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of incentive, and
Yeah.
there's plenty of money to be passed around to corrupt people within organizations, and sometimes they're just comments that are made in passing. You just have a light conversation with someone, and you accidentally divulge the type of endpoint protection or the type of intrusion detection. These people can conduct intelligence operations on critical infrastructures to gather some of the information that they need. And if they do happen to have somebody on the inside, that's even more helpful to them.
Yeah, it's very important to safeguard all the operational knowledge, operational security for your system. That's very important, and that shouldn't be just entrusted with everyone. And the people that we hire and keep in there, if they were long-time employees, we need to have a system where we periodically peek into the person's background and what they're doing to make sure that they're not.
It's almost like a
Change.
small internal affairs department
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
cybersecurity professionals or engineering professionals that have hands-on knowledge of the specific systems.
That's a
that
good
they're
way to
operating.
think of that, Joe. Yeah,
Because
internal
that kind
affairs.
of brings in the criminology element into that
Yeah.
for domestic operations. And I
Sure.
think that from an international perspective, I do think that cryptocurrencies and how we're paying for this
Sure.
is kind of, to an extent, creating new business models for criminals, which
Yeah.
is somewhat terrifying. If you say now DarkSide is a $60 million business, which is engaged in the operation of gaining ransoms from companies.
Yes.
How many more Colonial pipelines? We have millions of miles of pipeline in the U.S. We have thousands of natural gas power plants.
Yeah.
We have refineries. We have all kinds of equipment out there. And the scale of this is one of the ones that concerns me the most.
Well, Joe, we have the electricity, we have the power grid, we have nuclear power, and security there is tremendous. We saw in New York City, when just a small power outage, what it disrupted, it was catastrophic. And so, looking to the future, if I'm a terrorist or any kind of a nefarious person. With our motive, whatever motivates me, obviously the terrorists are motivated by ideology, and criminals are usually greed-driven by money. Yeah.
And I think that's very interesting because DarkSide, they put out, I think that group put out a statement that said, we didn't mean to cause this.
Right.
But what if the state actors get involved? What if Russia or China or North Korea, or actually China's not a state actor of terrorism, but what if Iran or North Korea or Russia decide to disable our core infrastructures? Then we have a concerted state actor with significant resources coming after.
Joe, that's an excellent point, because we have to remember that the national infrastructure for everything for the Department of Defense is not mutually exclusive from a lot of the private industry are very closely interrelated with the Department of Defense. Yep. So if you take down certain infrastructure, then obviously that's a vulnerability, and we won't get too far into that, but that creates a very significant vulnerability if you take down certain private industry. It affects the Department of Defense.
We saw pretty straightforward what happened here just with the Colonial Pipeline incident. There were gas lines. People couldn't get fuel. If that had extended for a longer period of time, or if this affected an area that had, for example, a military base or military installation, we would see significant impacts to the operations or the readiness of those groups.
Yes. Yeah. Joe, all of this. So I think moving forward, this just presages an indication this is going to be more and more prevalent. It's going to happen more because they see the opportunity. Every successful activity like this encourages more, obviously, just like any other criminal activity. If I get by with it, it's going to encourage more entrance into the market, right?
Do you think that the Colonial Pipeline incident will be a wake-up call or a watershed moment for our critical infrastructures, or do you think we run the risk of falling back to sleep, if you will? I think that significant investments are required in order to catch up particular technology components of these infrastructures. What do you think the likelihood is that this will be a watershed moment?
I think it will, Joe, because it impacted so many common people, I'll say, just everyday people, to such a large degree. For just a small amount of time, it was back online very quickly. But the thing we have to remember here is that this is just one of many infrastructures that are vulnerable. And I just saw an article this morning where they're considering the TSA, Transportation Security Agency, some more regulations of the cybersecurity aspect and more inspections, ISCI, ISSA, and those other agencies to do vulnerability assessments and determine what the vulnerabilities are and help the private sector.
Now, I in addition to being a Chief Information Security Officer, I'm also the Chief Compliance Officer for my company. I think that's the other side of things that people tend to forget. Many times, it's not just making sure that you set up the system correctly in the first place, but that you have processes that go behind and audit to make sure that that door is locked, that those passwords are changed, and those kinds of programs are many times neglected or deprioritized, and that's one of the areas that I'd like to hopefully us see make the right investments in these programs and investments in technology, and also investment in the compliance aspect of this to make sure that we are keeping up with the patching and keeping up with making sure that the passwords are changed, intrusion detection systems have the right configurations, firewalls have the right configurations, things like that.
And Joe, that's the component you're talking about is CETA, Security Education Training and Assessment, and keeping that up to date. The return on investment's tremendous. It costs really very little in the time out of individuals' day to do the training, to update your password. Don't put your password on a sticky. You see all these violations, and you go out in the industry now, and you still see these same violations, and you're like, wow, have we not learned anything? So I'll guarantee you the Colonial Pipeline has had a impact on both society and the industry.
Well, I think the aspect of our mindset, I think, from a corporate America probably needs to change as well, in that we tend to buy things and we run them into the ground. There is no maintenance, and once an asset is fully depreciated, it's just sitting there and earning for us. And if we don't have to patch it or update it or anything like that, then that's extra profit that we can take. But there's sometimes with cybersecurity, there's this balloon payment of saying you didn't invest in maintaining it, now you have to pay $5 million to some criminal group.
Yeah. Well, we look at things like that as a sunk cost, like it's just absolutely no value added. But you know, the great thing about the training and the assessment is a lot of it, Joe, is something you mentioned, the corporate suite, you know, the CEOs and the COOs, and is having a culture, a climate of security. Right. Instead of the haphazard, lackadaisical attitude. So, and it starts at the top, obviously. The CIO is often out here. Sometimes they're in the command suite and sometimes they're not. And so what we have to remember is they're very important, but it's not just the CIO's job. It's every single individual. And I'll equate that like to safety. We used to in the military talk about safety is everyone's business. Well, it's same here with cybersecurity. Security is everyone's business, because anyone that has access to that system is a potential risk, and we have to remember that. You know, it's so important.
I think that makes sense. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm sitting here with Professor Dennis Brown from Kennesaw State University. Thank you for taking the time to speak about this important topic. Hopefully there'll be some lessons learned out of this, and hopefully we'll make some changes.
Joe, I look forward to speaking with you more in the future about more specific topics as you see fit. It's always good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.